Hi everyone, Pastor Jimmy with Mount Pleasant Baptist Church coming to you today with chapter 16 in Genesis and our study on the characteristics and attributes of God we can find in each chapter of Genesis. So take a second, pause the video, grab your Bible, read Genesis chapter 16, come back, restart the video, and we'll look at the characteristics we can learn in chapter 16. All right, now that you've had a chance to read chapter 16, this is one of those chapters that as you read it, you start scratching your head. You may wonder, what are they thinking? What are they doing here? This was a man of faith that we saw, Abram. He was such a great man of faith, and now we see him fall into sin quickly, I might add. And we see him doing it for the second or third or fourth, or just again, we see him falling into sin. And we may wonder, what's going on? What we want to look at here, though, is what God does. How does God handle this? What does God say about their sin, and what happens in this chapter as far as the characteristics and attributes of God goes? The first thing that we see here as far as the characteristics of God is that we see a God who watches. Now, this may sound a little strange to you, but we see God watching all these events unfold. We see God sitting back and watching these things happen. We do not see Him interfering at this time. We see God just letting Abram and Sarai and Hagar and the others, we see them just continuing in their sin, and we see God watching and observing, I guess is a good way to put it. In verse 13, Hagar calls him, "You are the God who sees me." He is the God who saw her. He is the God who watches her. She saw in her life that God knew what was going on, and God was the one that was seeing her in her life. But God was also watching Abram, and He was also watching Sarai during this time. And as they were trying to figure out their own problems, God was letting them work and see their problems. Now, most of us have problems with this, though. We don't understand this aspect of God. We don't understand, how does God allow us to sin? Why does God just watch and allow us to sin? You see, God is not a God that forces us to love Him. He's not a God that forces us to go and do His will. He wants us to, He urges us to, and He loves us and shows us love and blessings, but we still have the right to do what we want. And so God doesn't always stop us from what I like to call self-inflicted wounds a lot of times. He still lets us do these things, but know this, God is always watching over us. Even when we're sinning, even when we're going against Him, He's still there watching, He's still there loving us. Which brings us to the next thing that we see. We see a God that is full of compassion. I think we've looked at this before, but we see once again God's compassion here. How do we know He had compassion? Well, one, He didn't get rid of Abram and Sarai when they sinned the way they did. He didn't choose another person to take this role that He's given Abram. He let them fall into their sin. He let them sin. He let Hagar leave, and He found compassion on her when He found her wandering in the desert, in the wilderness there. And so we see God being a God of compassion. Even when we can't see it, even when we think He's not there, He is still a compassionate God. She was wandering in the wilderness, and God's compassion came to her. When it did, it opened her eyes. When the Lord was there, she saw Him, and it opened her eyes. Many times in our life, we don't see God's compassion. We don't see Him working in our lives until we allow our eyes to be opened by Him. And so we see a God who watches over us. We see a God who sees all the things we do. But we see a God that doesn't immediately dismiss us. We see a God that doesn't immediately throw us away, or that He doesn't forsake us when we sin. What we see instead is we see a God that comes to Hagar. We see a God that is full of compassion, a God that is full of love when He comes to her. And we see a God that promises her great things. We see a God that is full of compassion on Abram and Sarai. Yes, they have problems after this. Yes, there is trouble in their household. And yes, there is trouble because of the sin that they've fallen into. But we don't see a God that is forcing them out of their sin. We see a God that lets them learn from their mistakes. But we see a God that is compassionate and loving toward them the entire time. Matter of fact, in the next chapter, when we go to the next video, we'll see a God that immediately comes back to Abram after this and makes a covenant with Abram. Now, we'll see the things He requires of him, but He does continue His compassion and His love and His promises with Abram through this. So remember, God is always there. God is always watching. He may not interfere in your life, but He loves you and He's compassionate, and He doesn't want you to fall into sin, but He wants you to understand and learn from the sin that you do fall into.